Amsterdam's red light district glows under legal protection. Sex work regulated, taxed, licensed since 2000. Yet 2 blocks away, a joint sold openly in a coffee shop sits in a legal gray zone that could vanish overnight. Why would a nation that legalized selling human bodies refuse to fully legalize a plant? The answer hides in a secret government memo, a UN treaty loophole, and one Dutch word that changed everything: gedogen, meaning tolerance. This is the calculated logic behind Holland's 2-tiered vice. To understand this contradiction, you need to meet the players. On one side, the Dutch government, sex worker unions, and city councils in Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Rotterdam, who spent decades building a system of licensed brothels, health checks, and labor rights. On the other side, coffee shop owners operating in legal limbo, police told to look the other way, and a set of international treaties Holland signed back in the 1960s. 3 questions drive this story. First, why did the Dutch government decide sex work was labor, but marijuana was still, on paper, a crime? Second, what invisible treaty from Vienna and New York tied the government's hands on drugs, but left prostitution untouched? And third, is this brilliant pragmatism, or is the whole thing a carefully disguised legal fiction the world just agreed not to question? To answer that, we have to go back to the canals of the 1960s, when this country was quietly rewriting its entire relationship with vice. To understand why Holland split vice into 2 separate boxes, you have to go back further than the 1960s, into the DNA of Dutch society itself. For centuries, this small, flat, waterlogged country survived by trade, not conquest. Trade meant compromise, and compromise meant learning to live beside people you fundamentally disagreed with. By the 20th century, Dutch society was organized into what historians call pillarization: separate Protestant, Catholic, and secular socialist communities, each with their own schools, newspapers, even their own soccer clubs, coexisting in the same small nation without collapsing into civil war. The trick was simple. Elites at the top of each pillar quietly agreed, disapprove loudly in public, tolerate privately in practice. That unwritten rule had a name: gedogen, formally illegal, informally permitted, as long as it didn't cause visible harm. This wasn't weakness. It was survival architecture for a small nation that could not afford to fight itself. Now fast forward to the 1960s. Amsterdam became a magnet on the hippie trail, a stop on the road from London to Kathmandu. Young travelers filled Dam Square, cannabis smoke drifting over canal houses built by 17th century merchants. Dutch authorities faced a choice familiar to any parent watching a rebellious teenager: crack down and risk losing control completely, or find a way to manage the behavior without endorsing it. In 1972, a government-appointed commission, led by a psychiatrist named Peter Baan, delivered a report that would quietly reshape Dutch drug policy for the next 50 years. The Baan Commission drew a hard line between drugs that posed, in their words, unacceptable risk, and drugs that posed a more manageable one: heroin and cocaine on one side, cannabis on the other. That single distinction became the seed of everything that followed: the 1976 Opium Act revision that decriminalized possession of small amounts of marijuana, and eventually, the birth of the coffee shop, a business that sells a product still technically illegal to manufacture or transport, tolerated only at the final point of sale. Meanwhile, a few streets away in Amsterdam's oldest neighborhood, sex work had been operating under its own version of gedogen for 400 years, dating back to the Dutch Golden Age, when sailors and merchants filled the port and city officials quietly decided that policing morality was less important than policing disorder. For most of the 20th century, prostitution existed in that same gray fog as cannabis. Not exactly legal, not exactly prosecuted. But by the 1990s, 2 forces pushed the government towards something cannabis never got: full legal recognition. First, human trafficking was exploding across Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Dutch police argued that an unregulated black market made trafficking easier to hide, not harder. Second, feminist and labor organizations, including sex worker unions themselves, argued that decades of stigma without regulation left women with no health protections, no contracts, and no legal recourse against abusive employers. In other words, cannabis stayed in legal limbo because the government saw a plant. Prostitution moved toward full legalization because the government, and a determined group of activists, reframed the debate around labor and human trafficking. One was treated as a substance to be managed. The other was treated as a form of work to be regulated. That distinction would decide everything that followed. There was one more piece the government could not simply legislate away: international law. In 1961, the Netherlands had signed the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, a treaty that classified cannabis alongside heroin and cocaine, and legally bound every signing nation to criminalize its production and sale. Breaking that treaty outright risked sanctions, isolation, and damaged trade relationships for a country whose entire economy depended on international shipping and commerce. So Dutch lawmakers found a loophole hiding in plain sight. They never actually legalized cannabis. They simply instructed prosecutors not to prioritize enforcement against small-scale possession and sale, so long as certain conditions were met. On paper, marijuana remained a crime. In practice, an entire industry of coffee shops sprang up through the late 1970s and 1980s, run by ordinary shop owners who kept meticulous records, paid taxes, and lived every single day with a law that could, in theory, shut them down overnight. Prostitution carried no such international treaty obligation. There was nothing stopping Parliament from writing sex work into formal law. And in the year 2000, that is exactly what they did. October 1999. Inside the Dutch Parliament building in The Hague, the vote was close, and it was loud. Lawmakers were debating a bill with a clinical, almost bureaucratic name: the lifting of the general brothel ban. Strip away the legal language, and it meant something enormous. For the first time in modern Dutch history, running a brothel would become a licensed, legitimate business. No different on paper from running a restaurant or a hair salon. Owners would need permits. Workers could register, pay taxes, and demand contracts. Health inspectors would check premises the same way they inspected any workplace. Supporters called it a triumph of pragmatism over hypocrisy. Legalize what already exists, and you gain the power to regulate it. But the opposition in that chamber was not what outsiders might expect. It wasn't only religious conservatives raising their voices. It was feminist organizations too, split down the middle. One camp, largely made up of sex worker unions themselves, argued that legal recognition was the only way to give women real protection, real bargaining power, and a path out of the shadows where abuse thrived unseen. The other camp, made up of abolitionist feminists and international anti-trafficking groups, argued the opposite, that legalizing the industry would only expand it, normalize it, and give traffickers a legitimate-looking storefront to hide behind. Both sides claimed to be protecting the same women. Both sides could not both be right. The bill passed. On October 1st, 2000, the law took effect, and Amsterdam's red light district transformed overnight from a tolerated gray zone into one of the most heavily regulated sex industries on Earth. Meanwhile, only a few hundred kilometers away, a very different kind of confrontation was building. France and Germany had grown furious watching busloads of their own citizens cross the border into towns like Maastricht and Terneuzen for the sole purpose of buying cannabis legally unavailable at home. What Dutch officials saw as a clever domestic compromise, their neighbors saw as an export problem. Drug tourism flooding across open EU borders with no checkpoints to stop it. Diplomatic pressure mounted through the 2000s, until Dutch border towns began experimenting with something unthinkable a decade earlier: banning foreigners from coffee shops altogether, a policy that would eventually be nicknamed the Weed Pass. The two experiments, prostitution and cannabis, were now moving in completely opposite directions. One was hardening into permanent, exportable law. The other was being quietly walled off at the border, restricted, and treated less like policy and more like a local secret the rest of Europe simply had to tolerate. Inside Amsterdam itself, the reaction to the Weed Pass proposal was almost the mirror image of the prostitution debate. Coffee shop owners, who had spent decades building a system of trust with local police, warned that banning tourists would not stop demand. It would simply push buyers back onto the street. straight into the hands of the same illegal dealers the tolerance policy had spent 40 years trying to sideline. Amsterdam's own city council eventually refused to enforce the tourist ban within city limits, effectively defying national policy in the name of local pragmatism, the exact same instinct that had built the coffee shop system in the first place. It was Gedogen turning back on itself, a policy of looking the other way now being challenged by officials who wanted to look the other way about the crackdown too. Meanwhile, in the newly legal red light district, accounts collected by Dutch outlets described women speaking of something they hadn't had before: the ability to call the police without fear of being the one arrested. To some, it was quiet proof the law was working exactly as designed. And just as legislators in The Hague celebrated what looked like a historic victory for regulation, a very different reality was about to surface. One that would force the country to ask whether legalizing prostitution had solved the problem it was built to fix, or simply given it a legal address. For the first few years after 2000, the numbers looked promising. Licensed windows meant registered workers, and registered workers meant, in theory, visibility. But Amsterdam's police soon noticed something troubling. Organized crime hadn't disappeared from the red light district. It had simply learned how to dress like a legitimate business. Criminal networks began quietly buying up window licenses, using legal storefronts as fronts to launder trafficked women into the system. Women holding contracts they never truly consented to, standing behind glass that was now, technically, government approved. By 2007, city officials in Amsterdam launched something called Project 112, named after the district's postal code, buying back and shutting down roughly a third of the red light windows in an attempt to push out the criminal money that had colonized the very system meant to eliminate it. The law hadn't failed exactly. It had simply revealed a harder truth. Legalizing an industry gives you the tools to regulate it, but only if enforcement keeps pace with the criminals adapting alongside it. Meanwhile, the coffee shop system was facing its own slow unraveling. The weed pass requiring Dutch residency was quietly abandoned in most major cities within a year of its introduction, undone by the same local defiance that had built the tolerance policy in the first place. But a deeper structural problem remained, one insiders had nicknamed the backdoor problem. Coffee shops could legally sell cannabis at the front counter, but the supply chain feeding that counter, the actual growing and transporting of the product, remained entirely illegal, forcing shop owners into the same criminal underworld the entire tolerance policy was designed to avoid. It was, as one Dutch politician put it, like legalizing the sale of stolen cars while keeping car theft itself illegal. By the 2010s, pressure was building from both directions. Cities wanted the criminal supply chains gone, and public health officials wanted quality control over a product millions of people were consuming without any government oversight of what was actually inside it. Both stories, on the surface, looked like slow, grinding disappointments. The regulated brothel system that was supposed to end trafficking instead gave traffickers a new disguise. The tolerated coffee shop system that was supposed to separate soft drug users from hard drug dealers still forced legal shop owners to buy product from the same underground growers who supplied everything else. Critics on both sides felt vindicated. The abolitionists pointed at Project 1012 as proof legalization could never outrun exploitation. The drug policy skeptics pointed at the backdoor problem as proof that half measures solve nothing. They only relocate the crime one step up the supply chain. And yet, something strange was happening beneath the surface of both failures. The very fact that these problems were visible, documented, debated in Parliament, investigated by police task forces, was itself a kind of victory neither fully underground system could have produced. You cannot fix a problem you cannot see. And for the first time in Dutch history, both vices were finally, however imperfectly, out in the light. Here is the piece almost nobody outside Dutch policy circles ever hears. Multiple times between the 1970s and the 2000s, Dutch officials quietly drafted plans to close the backdoor problem entirely, to legalize and regulate cannabis cultivation itself, not just its sale. Every single draft died before reaching a real vote. Not because of religious objection, not because public opinion opposed it. Polls consistently showed most Dutch citizens supported full legalization. The real obstacle was money, and not the money you'd expect. The Netherlands, like every modern economy, depends on its banks having smooth access to the global financial system, a system whose plumbing runs almost entirely through institutions bound by United States law and the same UN drug treaties Holland had signed decades earlier. If the Dutch government formally legalized cannabis cultivation, it would be manufacturing a controlled substance in direct violation of that treaty. And a formal treaty violation gives foreign regulators, especially American ones, legal grounds to treat Dutch financial institutions as facilitating drug trafficking, opening the door to correspondent banking restrictions that could quietly cripple Dutch banks' ability to clear transactions in US dollars. For a small trading nation whose entire economic identity depends on frictionless global finance, that risk was judged too dangerous to take, even for a policy most of the country wanted. Prostitution carried no such exposure. No treaty regulated it. No foreign banking regulator cared. So Parliament was free to legislate it into full legal existence without triggering a single international consequence. The plant stayed in legal limbo, not because of morality, but because of SWIFT codes and correspondent banking relationships. The sex trade became fully legal because, financially, nobody was watching. This is the twist buried under decades of moral debate. The entire difference between these two industries had almost nothing to do with ethics, and almost everything to do with which one could get away with defying international finance. And yet, even that explanation isn't the full picture. There is one more layer to this story, something happening right now, quietly, in a handful of Dutch cities, that suggests the calculation behind that decades-old fear might finally be starting to shift. But before we get to that, it's worth sitting with what this twist actually means. For 50 years, Dutch citizens were told their government was making careful moral distinctions between different kinds of vice, weighing risk, protecting the vulnerable, drawing thoughtful lines between what society could tolerate and what it could not. In reality, some of the most consequential lines in Dutch policy were drawn not by ethicists or lawmakers debating right and wrong, but by risk officers inside central banks calculating exposure to a financial system controlled thousands of miles away. In December 2023, something quietly began in two Dutch towns, Breda and Tilburg, that would have been unthinkable during the decades this backdoor problem festered. For the first time, coffee shops there started selling cannabis grown by government-licensed producers, tracked from seed to sale, entirely outside the criminal supply chain that had shadowed the industry since the 1970s. By April 2025, 10 municipalities across the country had joined what officials now call the Controlled Cannabis Supply Chain Experiment, a 4-year test to see whether a fully legal, bank-compliant cannabis market could actually survive contact with international law. Early inspections found something remarkable. Almost no evidence of licensed growers slipping product into the illegal market at all. For the first time in 50 years, the fear that had frozen Dutch drug policy in place was being tested against reality instead of speculation. But here is the gut punch hiding underneath that hopeful headline. 10 municipalities, out of hundreds, a handful of licensed growers, feeding a tiny fraction of the country's coffee shops. Meanwhile, in the fully legalized red light district, 25 years after that landmark law, police still describe organized crime infiltration as an ongoing, unsolved problem, not a historical footnote. Neither vice was ever actually solved. Both were simply managed at whatever level of visibility the state's finances and diplomacy could tolerate at the time. The uncomfortable truth this story leaves behind isn't about sex or drugs at all. It's about how rarely the moral lines a government draws in public have anything to do with the calculations happening quietly behind it. So the next time a policy gets explained to you in the language of right and wrong, ask a harder question. Whose bank accounts and whose treaties is that morality actually protecting? So here's the question worth sitting with. If a government's morality can bend for the right bank or the right treaty, what other moral policies in your own country are quietly shaped by money instead of principle? Drop your theory in the comments below. More interesting micro history coming up, so make sure you're subscribed before it drops.